All right, everybody, welcome to class. Today we're going to talk about urbanization and within that, urban problems, urban issues. Okay. In particular, segregation, gentrification, and urban renewal. And then we will talk about the ghetto as a historical and sociological problem. So let's get right into it. During the 1950s, middle-class residents in the United States flee to the suburbs en masse. Blue-collar jobs in manufacturing sort of vanishes, okay, in the city. So there's a rise of white-collar service jobs that take over the city area. Okay, this happens in the city. So there's a big flight of middle class residents fleeing, starting the movement towards the suburbs, which takes a couple of generations to complete. Okay, so the decades pass, let's say 30 years, something like that. And by then, by the 90s of the 20th century, there's an urban middle class, or rather an urban underclass, which had already emerged. Okay, an urban underclass. The same issues remain. There's no more manufacturing jobs in the city proper. By and large, with exceptions, obviously. This is a eagle's eye view. Okay. So no more manufacturing jobs. There are, by the 90s, more information age type jobs for which education is needed, obviously. So that is a barrier to entry for city jobs right in the urban metro area or metro areas. The only jobs besides white-collar jobs for which education is needed are service jobs. Okay, there's service jobs, cleaning jobs, serving jobs, restaurants, those sorts of jobs. Okay, which are not by and large well paid. So these are much lesser jobs, even in comparison to the manufacturing jobs, which did at some point offer some measure of security. Okay, so that's how the situation was laid out. Okay, by the 50s, after World War II, there's a huge movement towards moving to the suburbs by the middle class. Okay, and also this coincides with the advent of the car and the advent of the highway. So it's a whole movement, okay, towards that. And by the 90s, there's the underclass of the urban folks. Okay. Now, this presents a host of problems, right? Like, who is the underclass? Who is the middle class that gets to move to the open suburbs with better schools and new buildings and all these things that are, at least at first, linked to the suburbs? And also, the suburbs get a lot of money from the government for building, in particular, highways and other infrastructure. But moving on, okay, we're not gonna go too deep into it because we want to bring it more to the present moment. There is a sort of revival of the urban landscape, as it were, by the 90s. Though it starts before, but in the 90s it really kind of starts taking hold. And now I'm going to put this revival in quotation marks because it is not just a revival, but also a kind of the opposite of a revival, which would be a suffocation. Okay, depending on where you stand in terms of your social class, ethnic background, and so on, which are such important determinants in American history. Okay, so we have two forms of revival, okay? One of them which is mainly linked to the market, okay, which is linked to free, open capitalism, and the other one which is linked to the government, to governmental intervention, okay? The one that's linked to the market is called gentrification, okay? Gentry means high-income dwellers, essentially, high-income people. So the gentrification is the sort of flooding, as it were, of formerly impoverished areas, poorer areas, by high-income dwellers. Okay, deteriorated buildings are renovated, streets are fixed, and so on, as more affluent groups move into the area. Okay. So let's stay with this idea of gentrification for a minute, which we which call a revival in quotation marks. Revival / suffocation. How about that? In 1990, sociologist Elijah Anderson looked into gentrification in a Philadelphia neighborhood in a book that was published titled Race, Class, and Change in an Urban Community. Race, Class, and Change in an Urban Community. This happened in 1990. This book was published by Elijah Anderson in 1990. Among other things, Elijah found out that, I'm going to quote here from your sociology textbook, which quotes Mr. Anderson's findings. Quote, little fraternizing took place between the white newcomers and remaining black residents because the latter were mostly poor and the former were middle class, end quote, page 699 of your textbook on sociology. Little fraternizing took place between the white newcomers and remaining black residents because the latter were mostly poor and the former were middle class. So it's a class issue. Here, Marx comes in handy, as he so often does as a thinker, in terms of sociology and the social sciences. Okay, so we're going to leave that. We're just going to kind of touch it sort of superficially in order to grasp the concept of gentrification. Okay, which is this movement, free movement, because after all, the market was open by the 90s, obviously, and prior. And so if people wanted to move there, middle class, wealthier, the gentry, they were free to move there, and they did, and that's what we call gentrification. But of course, this displaces the local folks who live there, which we're going to address in a minute. The other form of revival is a non-open market. It is more government directed, or government enforced, or government erected. Okay, we call this urban renewal. Urban renewal. What is urban renewal? Using public funds to renew deteriorating neighborhoods. Using public funds to renew deteriorating neighborhoods. Sometimes, I guess, a level of urban renewal can be done in tandem between the city, okay, or the government, and private entities. That is done as well. But we're looking at the beginnings of this phenomenon in particular, which is urban renewal as a result of governmental policies. Okay, so there you go. Urban renewal as a result of governmental policies. So we can look back to 1949. To the Federal Housing Act, and 1954 for another Federal Housing Act. So we have two Federal Housing Acts, 1949, 1954. Basically, billions go from the government into renewal projects, into urban renewal projects. And to that, we can add another historical sort of investment by the government, which is the 1956 Federal Highway Act. 1956 Federal Highway Act, which used gas taxes to fund interstate highway systems. 1956 Federal Highway Act which used gas taxes to fund interstate highway systems. Okay, so we have that one as well. The book, the sociology book we're reading, calls it slum clearance. Okay, so they're not beating around the bush. Okay, so a lot of these projects are not fairly enacted. Okay, they are, money flows into one zone of society, the middle class, or even if it goes to the lower class, it's always sort of drawn along racial lines. Okay, which led the great James Baldwin, the African American author, to label, and I'm going to quote here, urban renewal as, quote, Negro removal, end quote. It's a strong quote, but James Baldwin knew what he was talking about, and in his very sort of trademark pithy delivery, labeled it thus. And so with that, we can see that, well, the phrase tells us that what the truth was, which a lot of the money actually ended up being delivered. And in fact, we can say that a lot of the money went actually to served as a way to farther solidify segregation in the United States, believe it or not. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in a bit. Okay. There was a study, okay, between 2010 and 2014, which looked at the data from that year between 2010 and 2014. We shouldn't forget that our book the sociology book we're reading was published in 2018. So, it's a little bit outdated, but not altogether outdated. And, these are historical facts anyway. So between 2010 and 2014, the study showed that the 10 largest metropolitan areas in the United States, were actually being subjected to this sort of revival that we have put in quotation marks, okay? But the study found that for households making less than $60,000 a year, households making less than $50,000 a year, which is well above the poverty line, that's well into the middle class, okay? Particularly by during the years 2010, 2014. Well, anyway, this study found that less people that were moving into the city than moving out of the city. In other words, more were moving out. So for households with less than $60,000, that made less than $60,000 a year, the actual movement was away from the city. So we can argue that the gentrification movement was really taking place in the 10 largest metropolitan cities or areas in the United States. Okay? And the book notes that the farther into lower incomes we look, the more families were moving away from the city. So, families making $50,000, $40,000, $30,000, and so on were really sort of having to leave the city in larger numbers. Okay, so this in particular, the book points out the Silicon Valley situation, which shows that the Bay Area of California, in which Silicon Valley is located, was a place that was, quote, hard hit by this situation, where even middle income families lower middle income, but middle income nonetheless, were subjected to market forces and urban renewal forces that forced them to move away from the 10 largest metropolitan areas, in this case, the San Francisco Bay Area. Okay. Now, let's move on to another issue that we have here in terms of urbanization. We're going to talk about segregation. Okay. What is segregation? Well, let me just put it in context first. Okay. Let me give you some data. 1/4 of 29 million African Americans living in the largest metropolitan areas in the United States are found in segregated neighborhoods. Okay, that's the kind of very strong data, right? 1/4 of 29 million African Americans living in the largest metropolitan areas are found in segregated neighborhoods. Okay, in that context, what is segregation? Segregation is, quote, neighborhoods where more than 4 out of 5 residents are black. In this particular context, okay? Segregation refers to, quote, neighborhoods where more than 4 out of 5 residents are black, okay? And that really coincides with the idea and the data that states that 1/4 of 29 million African Americans living in the largest metropolitan areas are found in segregated neighborhoods. Okay, that is the current or the situation up to the year in which it was reported. Okay, which I assume to be close to 2018, which was the publication date of our textbook. Okay, why? How could it be? Right? How could it be that we have this situation? Because, after all, wasn't it 1968 when the Fair Housing Act passed? 1968? That's a long time ago, right? So there's two main arguments of unequal validity. The first one is that people like to live next to those who look like them racially and I suppose economically. Some argue that people like to live next to those who look like them. That's one argument. The other argument, which we can say that Richard Rothstein argues well, in his book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, Richard Rothstein argues that housing built under Federal Public Works Administration, under the Federal Public Works Administration, was segregated on purpose, and that most went to white Americans. Okay, so you can say, why is the United States still segregated in many parts of its geography? Well, you can say because people like to live next to those who look like them. That's one argument. And the other argument that put forth best by Richard Rothstein argues that housing built under Federal Public Works Administration was segregated on purpose and that most went to white Americans. And he argues this in The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. Okay, so this does not go back just to like the 90s or the 70s. It goes back to the 30s. Why the 30s in particular? Because of Great Depression housing policies. Okay? It essentially works like this, okay? And it's almost horrifying, actually, that's the word. How this took place, because it's a domino effect that you can trace back rather easily. So it went on like this. Segregated black neighborhoods were either maintained by not allowing federal money to come in and allow African Americans to buy houses at the same rate as even working class white Americans, one, and also even when the neighborhoods were tweaked or rezoned, okay, they were rezoned many times for the worse, because industrial, aka toxic facilities often were built in those neighborhoods with under the excuse of rezoning and under the excuse of development, which actually turned them from ghettos into slums. And ghettos are not the same thing as slums, as we shall see. Okay? Ghettos and slums, even though sociologists use them, use the words interchangeably, they are actually different terms that have very different historical contexts. Anyway, there's a domino effect that takes place due to all of these bad faith developments. Okay, first you have the first result is that white working class Americans buy homes in okay neighborhoods at affordable prices because of the governmental intervention starting in the 1930s, but going on sort of expanding through the decades of the 20th century. Okay, so white working class Americans buy homes in okay neighborhoods at affordable prices, while black Americans are sent to rent housing in substandard neighborhoods. I say sent because essentially the government, by not distributing the help it provided equally, created the reality that sort of ushered or sent African Americans to rent housing in substandard neighborhoods that practically were the only neighborhoods that were open to many of them, including in the northern cities. Okay. So that's like an effect, right? Like a domino effect that continues over the decades. What happens next? Home ownership becomes the main source of wealth for white Americans. Let me say that again. Home ownership becomes the main source of wealth for white Americans, and homes appreciated over time. They became more expensive over time. So black Americans were denied that opportunity in large part by the U.S. government, historically, by not spreading the money equally amongst its citizens. So they are denied the opportunity to buy homes that could eventually appreciate and generate wealth, which, by the way, home ownership is the main source of wealth for white Americans. That right there is a direct governmental responsibility historically. Okay, so there's another domino effect, right, which is a result of the wealth gap. Okay, so now black income in 2018, I think, that's when the book was published, so I assume it to be correct and up to date. So black income was 60% of white income in the United States. So African Americans make about 60% of what white Americans make. Now you can say there's a difference there, but it's not overwhelming. Well, I think it's overwhelming, making 40% more as a population. Okay, but that's not what wealth is, because wealth is not the main source of, or rather, that's income is not the main source of wealth sociologically or even economically speaking. Income is not the main source of wealth economically speaking. What is the main source of wealth? Well, property, okay, housing, we just said that, house ownership, savings, which is passed on from generation to generation, stocks, and owning other real estate place besides from where you live. Okay, those are main sources of wealth. Income is just what you make a year. GDP per capita, that's measured at the national level. Okay, but that doesn't say everything. In fact, it doesn't say much. Okay, because you can make, let's say, $50,000 a year, but have inherited a big house from your parents. See that's worth $2 million. Whereas you can make $100,000 a year, but have not inherited anything, and so therefore who's more wealthy? Okay, so now comes the real horror. I think it's horror. These are my words. Is that black wealth in the United States is 5 to 7% that of white wealth in the United States. So African Americans, in terms of wealth, make about 5 to 7%, or have 5 to 7% as much wealth as white Americans. The differences are astronomical, mammoth, just horrifying, because it talks about that within the United States we have such a large wealth gap. Okay, so and now to see that the government actually played a role in this, in fact perhaps the main role, now we're seeing the horror as stated in the classic novel by Joseph Conrad. So now what's the result of this wealth gap? It's easy to see. It's harder for African Americans to buy homes today, right? And also it's harder for African Americans to send their children to college. Okay, for obvious reasons. There's no wealth to be spread around as much. Okay. Sociologist Matthew Desmond, who wrote a book called Evicted: Poverty and Profit in the American City, brings us up to date, because we've been looking at historical sort of moves by the U.S. government that have resulted in this situation. Okay, like in the 1930s, the Great Depression, housing policies, the urban renewal policies, all these things that happened historically, the Fair Housing Act. Okay, we looked at what else did we look at? We looked at the Federal Highway Act in 1956, which used taxes to fund the interstate highway system, and so on. So we looked at a lot of these moves, right? And most notably, 1949, 1954, Federal Housing Acts, which pumped millions into renewal projects. Okay, but what Matthew Desmond does is he brings all of this up to date in his 2016 book, Evicted: Poverty and Profit in the American City. Basically, he, according to your book, he narrows it down to a particular issue, which is the huge power of the landlord in today's urban landscape. Okay, the huge power of the landlord in today's urban landscape. Why? Because the market sort of wins, right? Like free market dominates, and so the landlord becomes an all-powerful entity that can say, you live here, we accept you to live here if you are worthy economically, or if you don't pay, we evict you. Okay, and so because so many people need housing, particularly in the urban landscape, the landlord, which by the way, it may be a singular individual, but most likely it's a conglomerate or a group of individuals that own a particular building. So the landlord is so powerful. Okay, and Matthew Desmond, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his book, points out how key affordable housing is in anti-poverty fight. Okay, so a few things that are key in anti-poverty fight are education, absolutely higher education, or education in general, families, keeping families together, doing the best possible to keep families together, because it has been seen that kids who grow up in family units do much better than kids who are products of so-called broken homes. Okay, but also what Matthew Desmond points out is how key affordable housing is in anti-poverty fight. So it's not just a governmental thing, or rather it's a governmental thing, but also at the private level, we should work towards making housing affordable. All right, I'm just going to go on for like 15 more minutes at the most, maybe 5 more minutes. Now, we can look at the ghetto, okay, as a historical and social problem. First of all, like I had said before, a ghetto and a slum are not the same thing, okay? A slum is a place where poor people, including dominant racial groups or religious groups such as poor whites in the United States, can live. So a place where poor people live, okay? The ghetto, historically speaking, is a place where ethnic groups who are not necessarily poor by definition, they may be middle class or even upper class, such as in Italy, where the term originated, are forced to live. So in the slum, the people there are not forced to live there, and they're poor, but they're not necessarily all minority groups or non-dominant groups. Dominant groups such as poor whites in the United States may live in the slum. Now the ghetto is decreed by law, okay? So you can say, okay, how is it decreed by law today that Latinos and African Americans have to live in ghetto? Well, historically, we can see that it was illegal to sell houses to African Americans in many neighborhoods, perhaps even most neighborhoods in the United States, so that they were legally bound to these particular neighborhoods, okay? Now, the term ghetto comes from the 16th century Italy, where in Rome and Venice in particular, Jews were forced to live in neighborhoods that were, well, segregated by force, by official law, or rather by official decree enacted by popes, okay, isolating them from the mainstream dominant group, which were Christians, essentially, okay? So that's where it comes from, 16th century. Now, obviously, in 20th century, 19th century United States, things change, but only to a degree, because there is, even though there's not a law that says necessarily at the national level, I think it's more of a law at the kind of local state level that says, well, you know, these places may only be sold to these particular groups of people. Okay. Then, even though we have open markets today, you can say, how come people don't move out, right, of these kind of difficult places? First of all, sociology, according to your book, shows that poor people don't like to move because they are sustained by social networks and neighborhood institutions. So this is something that gets built over decades. And if people move right away or too many times, then they lose the social networks and the neighborhood institutions that sustain them. We are going to end today's discussion by talking about Hurricane Katrina, which struck New Orleans in 2005, tragically. And I'm just going to pose a question, which actually I'm not posing it, is the book that poses, but I'm going to discuss it, which is why were poor African Americans afflicted the most during Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans in 2005? There are 3 reasons that the book gives us, okay? 3 reasons as to why African Americans were afflicted the most during Hurricane Katrina in 2005, or places where African Americans lived, okay? Number 1, basically there wasn't, in these neighborhoods where poor African Americans lived in during the Hurricane Katrina horror, there were not as many drainage and pumping systems that were in working order or that were as up to date as the ones available in middle class or middle class / white neighborhoods in the city. Okay. Now, in terms of the second reason, it would be limited networks outside of the zones. So this kind of ghetto historical situation of the ghetto made it so that many of the residents in these poor, heavily African American neighborhoods did not have as many connections outside of the neighborhood as their Anglo counterparts. Okay, so there you go. That's a second reason. Limited networks outside of those poor zones, which were already underserved to begin with. And number 3, limited economic resources at the individual level, which takes us back to the income disparity and the wealth disparity gaps, which by and large, going full circle, may be blamed on bad policies at the governmental level. Okay, and also this leads us to the next question, or the next topic, which is the topic of the environment, environmental changes and tragedies that are going to take place, and that are taking place and have been taking place, and how they affect some more than others, though they do affect all of us. Okay, so I just presented a few problems that come up in your sociology book, a few problems dealing with the urban world, in particular segregation, gentrification, and urban renewal. Okay, have a nice day, take care, and I'll have a few questions for you to answer at the end of class. Bye-bye.